Welcome, dear listener. Make yourself comfortable and allow the night to slow. This calm, old-time radio detective story is meant to be listened to gently. If you fall asleep, the story will continue quietly beside you. This is Hercule Mysteries, Chapter 1, The Quiet Hour. Welcome, dear listener. If you are hearing this now, then the day has finally loosened its grip on you. The brightness has faded, the noise has thinned, the world has settled into that gentle pause that arrives late at night, when time no longer pushes forward but seems instead to drift. This is the quiet hour, the hour when houses remember things, when clocks sound louder than they should, when a single footstep can feel like a message. On Maraway Crescent, where brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder in polite symmetry, the night arrived without drama. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains. Windows reflected moonlight rather than movement. The street itself seemed to breathe more slowly, as though it too were preparing for rest. Number 19 stood quietly among its neighbors. It was not an unusual house, narrow, tall, and built during a time when hallways were designed to carry sound rather than absorb it. It had stood on that street for decades, without drawing attention. People passed it every day without noticing its door, its windows, or the faint history held in its walls. Inside, Edwin Hargrove sat alone. He occupied the sitting room at the front of the house, where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light across an armchair and the small table beside it. A book rested open in his hands, its pages unmoving for several minutes now. His eyes followed the lines automatically, but his mind wandered elsewhere, toward the steady rhythm of the house itself. The clock ticked, tick, tick, tick. Edwin found comfort in that sound. He always had. The hall clock had belonged to his parents before him. It had measured birthdays, holidays, arguments, and long evenings exactly like this one. Its chime was familiar enough to fade into the background of his life, marking time without demanding attention. Tonight felt no different. That was the unsettling part. Edwin shifted in his chair and glanced toward the hallway. The passage stretched away from the sitting room in a straight, orderly line, its runner rug lying perfectly centered along the floorboards. At the far end, the clock stood tall and calm, its face pale in the low light. He smiled faintly and returned his attention to the book. At 11:58 p.m., the house remained peaceful. At 11:59 p.m., the minute hand reached the top of the clock face. The chime sounded. Chime. One note, low, measured, final. Edwin barely reacted. He turned a page and settled back into his chair, already allowing the sound to pass into memory. Then he heard something else. At first it was so subtle that his mind tried to dismiss it. A shift of air, perhaps. A creak in the house settling, the imagination stretching itself before sleep. But the sound returned. A step. Not hurried, not careless. Placed deliberately, as though whoever made it knew exactly where their foot would land. Edwin's eyes lifted from the page. He listened. Another step followed, then another. The footsteps moved slowly down the hallway, each one arriving with just enough weight to be heard, but never loudly enough to announce itself. They did not echo sharply, nor did they scrape the floor. They were measured, controlled, and calm. Too calm. Edwin lowered the book. "Lydia?" he called softly. His voice sounded louder than he expected in the quiet room. No answer came. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the space they left behind. Edwin waited, his heart beating a little faster now, not with fear, but with alert curiosity. Old houses made noises, pipes cooled, wood expanded and contracted. Sounds traveled differently at night. He waited for the steps to resume. They did not. After a moment, he exhaled and shook his head at himself. Of course. He smiled faintly, annoyed at his imagination, and returned his attention to the book. Behind him, unseen, the clock resumed its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Upstairs, Lydia Hargrove lay awake. She had gone to bed earlier than usual, complaining of a dull headache and the strange fatigue that sometimes followed long days. Now she stared at the ceiling, listening, not anxiously, but attentively. The chime had woken her. It always did. She counted the seconds afterward without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps began. They did not surprise her. That was what troubled her most. She lay very still, her hands folded loosely over the blanket, her breathing slow and measured. She had learned, over time, that reacting too quickly only made the sound linger. It was better to listen first, better to wait. The steps moved past her door. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in the house, something paused. Then the footsteps continued. The next morning arrived gently. Sunlight filtered Through the curtains, the house resumed its daytime sounds, cups in the kitchen, the kettle heating, the distant hum of traffic beginning its daily routine. Edwin sat at the breakfast table, stirring his tea. "You sleep well?" he asked casually. Lydia nodded. "Well enough." She did not mention the footsteps, neither did he. That was how the house worked, Edwin realized. Things that belonged to the night rarely followed people into daylight. Spoken aloud, they lost their shape. Better to leave them where they were. The day passed without incident. Lydia left for work. Edwin went about his routine. The memory of the footsteps softened, fading into the background noise of ordinary life. By evening, it almost felt foolish. The second night was quieter, too quiet. Edwin lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. The walls seemed closer now, the air heavier. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes, waiting for sleep to arrive. The clock chimed. The sound felt sharper than before. Immediately the footsteps began. This time, Edwin did not pretend. He sat up in bed, heart beating fast now, his attention fully awake. He recognized the rhythm instantly, the same measured pace, the same careful placement. They were closer. "Lydia!" he called, louder now. No answer. The steps moved down the hallway and stopped directly outside his door. Edwin's breath caught. He waited. The handle did not turn. The door did not move. The presence lingered just long enough to be unmistakable. Then the footsteps withdrew. They moved away, slowly, retreating down the hall until they vanished into silence. Edwin remained sitting upright until dawn. On the third night, Lydia did not come downstairs. Morning arrived, and her room stood exactly as she had left it. Bed neatly made, shoes aligned by the wall, handbag resting on the chair. There was no note. No sign of haste, no sign of struggle, only absence. Edwin searched the house in disbelief. He called her name. He checked every room. He stepped outside onto Marroway Crescent, scanning the street as if she might simply be standing there, waiting. She was not. By evening, the police had been notified. Questions were asked, reassurances were offered, possibilities were suggested gently and then more firmly. Edwin listened without hearing, because when night fell, the footsteps returned. This time Edwin did not wait. He reached for the telephone. The number had been given to him months earlier by a friend who spoke of the man with a mixture of respect and curiosity. A detective, he had said, who noticed what others overlooked. A man who listened. Edwin dialed with trembling fingers. The line connected. A calm, precise voice answered. "Hercule Poirot speaking." Edwin swallowed. "I was told you listen," he said. On the other end of the line, Poirot did not interrupt. He listened, and as Edwin spoke, of the clock, the footsteps, the silence, and his sister's disappearance, the night on Marroway Crescent held its breath. Chapter 2. Footsteps in the hall. There are nights when the dark feels close, not threatening, not heavy, just nearer than usual. Edwin Hargrove felt this closeness as he sat alone in the sitting room after making the telephone call. The receiver still rested in his hand, warm from contact, the quiet hum of the line reminding him that the connection had ended. Not because it had been cut, but because it had been completed. Hercule Poirot had listened. That knowledge brought a strange comfort. Outside, Marroway Crescent had settled into its familiar late-night stillness. The street lamps cast soft halos of light onto the pavement. Curtains remained drawn. Somewhere far off, a motor car passed and faded again, its sound dissolving into the distance. Inside the house, the clock continued its steady vigil. Tick, tick, tick. Edwin replaced the receiver gently and rose from his chair. He did not rush. He had learned, over the past 3 nights, that rushing only sharpened the silence. Slow movement felt safer, as though the house responded better when it was treated with patience. He walked toward the hallway. The runner rug lay perfectly aligned, just as it always had. He noticed now how carefully it softened sound. Footsteps on it were never quite silent, but they were never loud either. They existed in a middle space, half heard, half imagined. Edwin paused at the threshold. "Lydia," he called softly, though he knew there would be no answer. The house did not reply. That night, Edwin did not go to bed. He sat instead in the chair near the hallway, his body angled so he could see the length of the passage clearly. The lamp behind him provided just enough light to reveal shape without banishing shadow. He wanted to see, but not too much. Time stretched. The minutes before midnight always felt longer than those after. Edwin watched the clock face with an intensity that surprised him. Each movement of the minute hand seemed deliberate, purposeful. as though the mechanism itself were aware of his attention. At 11:58 p.m., the house felt alert. At 11:59 p.m., Edwin's breathing slowed, not by choice, but by instinct. The clock chimed. Chime. The sound was deep and steady, carrying easily through the hallway and into the rooms beyond. Edwin felt it in his chest, the way one sometimes felt thunder before hearing it. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then, a step, clearer this time, closer. Edwin did not flinch. He did not speak. He listened. Another step followed, then another. The footsteps moved along the hallway with the same careful rhythm he had heard before. Each one landed where the rug absorbed most of the sound, allowing just enough to remain. Whoever or whatever walked there knew the space intimately. Edwin's fingers curled against the arm of the chair. The steps passed Lydia's door. They did not pause. That detail unsettled him more than anything else. On the first 2 nights, the sound had lingered near her room, as though acknowledging her presence. Now it moved with certainty, past her door toward him. The steps stopped outside the sitting room. Edwin's heart beat loudly in his ears. He waited. The silence that followed felt deliberate, not empty, not accidental. It felt like a pause in a performance, one meant to draw attention. Edwin held his breath. The footsteps did not resume. Instead, something brushed lightly against the door frame. Fabric, skin, or something close enough to either. Edwin swallowed. The brushing sound stopped. Then came a new sound. 3 light taps against the wall, not a knock, a test. Edwin felt an urge rise in him, sudden and strong, to respond, to speak, to break the silence. The impulse surprised him with its intensity. He resisted. The taps did not repeat. After a long moment, the footsteps withdrew. They retreated down the hallway at the same measured pace, fading into silence that felt heavier now than before. Edwin exhaled slowly. The clock ticked on. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot arrived the following evening. Edwin heard the knock at the door just after dusk and opened it at once, relief overtaking caution. The man who stood on the step was smaller than Edwin had expected, neatly dressed, his posture precise and composed. Hercule Poirot stepped inside and paused. He did not speak immediately. He listened. Edwin noticed this at once. The way Poirot's attention seemed to settle into the space itself, as though the house were offering him information without words. "This house," Poirot said finally, "has learned to wait." Edwin stared at him. "You can feel it?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I can hear it." They sat together in the sitting room as night approached. Poirot asked questions, not rapidly, not insistently, but patiently. He asked Edwin to describe the sounds again, the timing, the rhythm, the distance between each step. Poirot listened without interruption. When Edwin finished, Poirot nodded. "You noticed something important," Poirot said. "The footsteps are not searching." Edwin frowned. "Then what are they doing?" "They are repeating," Poirot replied. "Repetition is comforting to the one who performs it." Edwin felt a chill. "You think someone practices this?" Poirot nodded. "Practice is the language of control." Midnight approached. Poirot insisted the lights remain on, not bright but present. Darkness, he explained, encouraged imagination. And imagination was not evidence. At 11:59 p.m., Poirot raised one finger. The clock chimed. Chime. The footsteps began immediately. Poirot closed his eyes, not in fear but in concentration. "1," he murmured. "2, 3. The steps moved steadily down the hallway. Poirot's head tilted slightly. "They are lighter tonight," he said. "Less confident," Edwin whispered. "Why?" "Because," Poirot replied softly, "they know they are being listened to." The footsteps stopped outside the sitting room. Poirot did not move. He spoke calmly, clearly, as though addressing someone he could see. "You may stop now," he said. The silence that followed felt tense, stretched thin like a wire. Poirot continued, his voice gentle but firm. "You have been heard. There is no need to continue." The footsteps did not resume. After several seconds they withdrew. Poirot opened his eyes. He stood and crossed to the hallway. The passage lay empty. Poirot crouched near the runner rug, examining it closely without touching. "There," he said, pointing. Edwin leaned closer. "I don't see anything." Poirot smiled slightly. "You see the floor?" he said. "I see the memory of feet," Poirot explained carefully. "The weight distribution, the corrected steps, the absence of natural hesitation. Whoever walks here," Poirot said, "has practiced not being heard." Edwin's throat tightened. "Then, Lydia?" Poirot nodded gently. She was not taken suddenly, he said. She was prepared. The words settled heavily between them. Later, in the early hours, Poirot walked the house alone. He listened to the stairs protest under his weight. "These stairs," he noted aloud, "do not forgive impatience." They went upstairs together. In the spare room, Poirot found the window slightly loosened, not broken, adjusted. Poirot nodded. In Lydia's room, his attention went immediately to the bedside table. A small portable radio sat there. Poirot turned it over. The casing bore faint marks. Recent. "This," Poirot said quietly, "is not for listening." Edwin stared. "Then what is it?" "For answering," Poirot replied. As dawn approached, Poirot sat once more in the sitting room. "This house," he said, "has been used as a stage." Edwin felt exhausted. "Then what happens now?" Poirot folded his hands. "Now," he said, "we listen more carefully than the one who believes he controls the sound." The clock ticked on, no footsteps returned, but the house no longer felt innocent. Chapter 3. The room that would not answer. There are rooms that respond when you enter them. They shift, they acknowledge presence, they creak or sigh or adjust themselves in small, familiar ways. And then there are rooms that do not answer at all. Hercule Poirot noticed the difference immediately. He stood at the base of the stairs in the Hargrove house, one hand resting lightly on the banister, listening not for footsteps but for expectation. Edwin stood a step behind him, tense now in a way he had not been before. It was one thing to hear strange sounds alone. It was another to watch someone else hear them too, and recognize them. "This house," Poirot said quietly, "has learned where silence is expected." Edwin frowned. "What does that mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It means someone has taught it." They ascended the stairs slowly. Poirot made no effort to disguise the sound of his steps. Each footfall landed naturally, honestly. The stairs responded with gentle protest, a soft complaint of age and use. "You hear?" Poirot asked. Edwin nodded. "They always do that." "Yes," Poirot said. "They speak when asked." They reached the landing. At the end of the corridor stood Lydia's room. The door was closed. It had been closed since the morning she disappeared. Poirot stopped several feet away. He did not reach for the handle. He listened. The hallway felt different at night. Edwin had always known this, but now the sensation sharpened into something almost tangible. Sound behaved differently here. Even breath felt louder. The runner rug muted steps but did not erase them. The walls reflected just enough to make every movement feel observed. Poirot leaned slightly toward the door. "Do you hear anything?" Edwin whispered. Poirot shook his head. "That," he said, "softly is precisely the problem." Edwin's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Poirot straightened. "A lived-in room always answers," he explained. "It holds warmth, memory, expectation. Even empty, it responds." He gestured toward the door. "This one does not." Poirot reached out and opened it. The room lay exactly as Edwin remembered it. The bed was made neatly, the covers smoothed with care rather than haste. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing a pale sliver of moonlight to reach the floor. Lydia's handbag rested on the chair beside the window, its strap aligned carefully, as though placed with intention. Poirot stepped inside. The air felt still, not stale, still. Poirot crossed the room slowly, his eyes moving deliberately, taking in details that Edwin had seen 100 times without truly noticing. "She did not leave in fear," Poirot said. Edwin swallowed. "How can you tell?" Poirot gestured toward the bed. "No disturbance," he said. "No hurried movement. Fear leaves fingerprints." He paused at the bedside table. There, beside a book and a small lamp, stood the portable radio. Poirot picked it up gently. "This," he said, "has been handled recently." Edwin stared. "She barely used it." Poirot turned the radio over. The casing bore faint marks along its edge, scratches too precise to be accidental. "It has been opened," Poirot said. "Often." He adjusted a dial. A low hum emerged, not a broadcast, not quite static. Something between. Edwin felt his skin prickle. "What is that?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He listened. Then he smiled, not with pleasure but with understanding. "This radio," Poirot said softly, "is not for receiving." Edwin's voice trembled. "Then what is it for?" "For responding," Poirot replied. They left Lydia's room quietly and moved down the hall. Poirot stopped at the spare room. This door stood slightly ajar. Edwin frowned. No one uses that room. Poirot pushed the door open. Inside, the space was bare but not unused. The bed was untouched, but the curtains were unevenly drawn. The window latch had been loosened, not opened fully, but adjusted. Poirot crossed to the window. "The air here," he said, "has moved recently." Edwin shook his head. "She wouldn't." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Do not assume unwillingness," he said. "Assume instruction." On the floor near the window lay a small object. Poirot knelt and picked it up carefully. A metronome. Edwin frowned. "For music?" "For timing," Poirot replied. He wound it gently. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound filled the room evenly, calmly. Poirot stopped it. "Footsteps," he said, "are rhythm without melody." Edwin felt cold understanding settle into his chest. "She practiced," he whispered. Poirot nodded. "And someone practiced with her." Midnight approached again. Poirot insisted they return downstairs. "This," he said, "must be heard where it expects to be heard." They sat in the sitting room, lamps lit softly, the house holding itself still around them. Edwin's hands trembled slightly. Poirot noticed but said nothing. The clock reached the top of the hour. Chime. The sound resonated through the house. They waited. The footsteps began almost immediately. Poirot closed his eyes. "1," he murmured. "2. 3. The steps moved down the hallway with careful precision. Poirot listened intently. "They are correcting themselves," he said softly. "That tells me this is not habit alone. It is performance." The footsteps slowed near Lydia's door. Poirot opened his eyes. "They expect her there," he said. The steps paused, then continued. They stopped outside the sitting room. Poirot stood. He moved calmly toward the door, not abruptly, not stealthily. "You may stop," Poirot said clearly. The footsteps froze. Poirot spoke again, his voice firm but unraised. "You have achieved what you intended," he said. "You have been heard." The silence stretched. Poirot added gently, "There is no need to continue." The footsteps withdrew. They retreated slowly, fading into the far end of the hall. Poirot opened the door. The hallway was empty. Edwin exhaled shakily. Poirot returned to his chair. "Now," Poirot said, "we know this much." He folded his hands. "Your sister was not taken by force," he continued. "She was led." Edwin felt tears prick his eyes. "Led where?" Poirot looked thoughtful. "To a place where sound behaves differently," he said, where silence can be shaped." Edwin whispered. "Why would she go?" Poirot met his gaze. "Because," he said, "she was taught that obedience would bring safety." The clock ticked on. No footsteps returned, but the house felt changed now, aware of itself in a way it had not been before. Poirot rose. "Tomorrow," he said, we will follow the sound back to its source." Edwin nodded, exhausted. Upstairs, Lydia's room remained silent. It did not answer. Chapter 4. The signal beneath the silence morning did not arrive suddenly. It never did in the Hargrove house. Instead, it seeped in quietly, as though the night were reluctant to leave all at once. Pale light gathered behind the curtains, softening shadows without banishing them entirely. The house shifted gently, wood adjusting, pipe stirring, the faint suggestion of life returning to familiar routines. Hercule Poirot had not slept. He sat in the sitting room, perfectly still, listening not for sound, but for the absence of it. There was a difference, he knew, between quiet that followed rest and quiet that followed vigilance. This house held the second kind. Edwin descended the stairs slowly, his movements careful, as though sound itself might disturb something delicate. "You're awake," Edwin said unnecessarily. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes." Edwin hesitated. "Did you hear anything?" Poirot considered. "I heard what did not happen." Edwin frowned. "The footsteps," Poirot explained gently. "They did not return." Edwin let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "That's good, isn't it?" Poirot stood and adjusted his jacket. "It is information," he said. "Whether it is good depends on what follows." They began the day with tea. Poirot insisted on routine. He believed routine grounded people, especially when the familiar had begun to feel uncertain. The kettle boiled. Cups were placed on the table. The ordinary sounds felt reassuring in their predictability. Poirot watched Edwin closely. "You did not remove the runner rug," Poirot observed. Edwin shook his head. I thought maybe later. Poirot nodded approvingly. Good, he said. Do not erase evidence before it has finished speaking. They finished their tea in silence. Then Poirot stood. Now, he said, we must follow the sound. The radio lay on the sitting-room table where Poirot had placed it the night before. In daylight it looked harmless, ordinary, a small portable set, like thousands of others sold in shops and catalogues. Edwin found it almost absurd that such an object could be connected to the fear that now lived quietly in his chest. Poirot lifted it carefully. In the dark, Poirot said, we imagine. In the light, we examine. He removed the back casing. Inside, the radio's interior had been altered. Wires had been added, thin, deliberate, neatly soldered. The modifications were subtle enough to escape casual notice, but unmistakable to someone who knew where to look. This, Poirot said softly, is not the work of an amateur. Edwin leaned closer. What does it do? Poirot turned a small dial. A low hum filled the room. Not static, not music, a signal. Edwin felt the sound more than he heard it, a faint vibration that seemed to settle somewhere. Behind his eyes, Poirot nodded. It transmits, he said. Short range, precise, Edwin swallowed. To whom? Poirot smiled faintly. That, he said, is what we will discover. Poirot replaced the casing and carried the radio toward the window. He held it carefully, adjusting the dial with practiced patience. The hum sharpened, then softened, then sharpened again. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Listen, he said. Edwin closed his eyes. At first he heard only the hum, then, beneath it, something else. A faint click, not mechanical, intentional. Edwin's breath caught. Did you hear that? Poirot nodded. Yes. He adjusted the dial again. The hum changed, and then, faint but unmistakable, a voice emerged. Not distorted, not loud, measured. Stand by, the voice said. Edwin froze. Poirot did not react. He listened. The voice did not repeat itself. The signal faded. Poirot turned the radio off. The room felt suddenly lighter, as though a pressure had been lifted. Edwin stared at Poirot. They were talking to her. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, he said, and she was listening. They sat for a long moment after that. Edwin's thoughts raced, but Poirot allowed no rush. Sound, Poirot said finally, is persuasive when it is predictable. Edwin frowned. What do you mean? Poirot folded his hands. A voice that comes at the same hour, he said. Footsteps that follow the same rhythm. A chime that signals when to expect the next instruction. Edwin felt cold understanding settle in. They trained her, he whispered. Poirot met his gaze. Yes, he said, and training takes time. Edwin clenched his fists. Why Lydia? Poirot considered. She worked with sound, he said. At the theatre, timing cues, effects, rhythm. Edwin nodded slowly. She was always precise. Poirot nodded. And precision is attractive to those who seek control. They left the house late that afternoon. Poirot insisted on walking rather than driving. We must hear the city, he said. Marroway Crescent seemed different by day, less ominous, more ordinary. Children played further down the street. A delivery cart rattled past. A radio played faintly from an open window. Poirot stopped several times, adjusting the radio's dial. Each time the hum shifted slightly. This signal, Poirot said, does not travel far. It is not meant to. Edwin frowned. Why not? Because intimacy, Poirot replied, creates obedience. They followed the signal block by block. The hum grew stronger near the old industrial district where warehouses stood half empty and buildings remembered different purposes. Poirot paused near a tall brick structure with boarded windows. Here, he said. Edwin looked up. That place is abandoned. Poirot smiled faintly. Not abandoned, he said, repurposed. Inside, the building was quiet in a different way. The silence. Here was thick, absorbent. Sound did not echo sharply. It softened, faded, disappeared. Poirot inhaled slowly. Soundproofed, he said. They moved carefully through wide corridors and open spaces that bore faint traces of their former life. Chalk marks on the floor, hooks on the walls, Numbers stenciled faintly near doorways, rehearsal rooms. Poirot stopped before one heavy door. He placed his hand against it. Nothing responded. "This," Poirot said softly, "is where silence is shaped." Edwin's heart raced. "She's here?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he listened. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "She is waiting." They did not enter. Not yet. Poirot stepped back. "Patience," he said. "We must not break the pattern too quickly." Edwin looked at him desperately. "What if she—" Poirot raised a hand. "She is not in danger," he said calmly. "She is being held by expectation." They retreated quietly. Outside, Poirot adjusted the radio once more. The hum returned briefly, then stopped. Poirot smiled faintly. "They noticed," he said. Edwin's voice trembled. "What happens now?" Poirot met his gaze. "Now," he said, "we wait for the one who believes he commands the silence to reveal himself." They returned to Marroway Crescent. As evening fell, the house greeted them without sound. That night the clock chimed. No footsteps followed, but somewhere else in the city, a signal waited to be answered. Chapter 5: The Hour Between Commands. There is an hour at night that feels like a doorway. It opens quietly, it closes without warning, and while it is open, people become more suggestible than they realize. Hercule Poirot called it the hour between commands, not because the night itself issued commands, but because certain people learned how to hide instruction inside routine. A chime, repeated often enough, became permission. Footsteps, repeated carefully enough, became certainty. Silence, stretched to the correct length, became a leash. And once the leash existed, the person holding it did not need to pull hard. Edwin Hargrove did not sleep that evening. He tried. He lay in bed with his eyes closed, waiting for the heaviness of sleep to arrive. But his mind returned again and again to what Poirot had discovered. The voice beneath the hum, the old building where sound was softened, the idea that Lydia was not simply missing but waiting. Waiting, Edwin realized, was the most exhausting thing. Downstairs, Poirot sat calmly in the sitting room, his posture composed, his hands folded neatly. He had asked Edwin to rest anyway, as though sleep were a duty rather than a reward. "Even if you do not sleep," Poirot had said gently, "your body must learn that the night does not own you." But Edwin's body had not learned that yet. At 10:45 p.m., he got up and went downstairs. Poirot looked up when Edwin entered. "Ah," Poirot said. "You are awake." Edwin nodded. "I can't—" Poirot raised a hand softly, interrupting without impatience. "You do not need to explain," Poirot said. "Tonight we listen together." Edwin sat opposite him. The lamplight was low and warm. The hallway beyond remained a narrow corridor of shadow, the runner rug lying perfectly centered, as if it had never been disturbed. At the far end, the hall clock stood silent and dignified, its pendulum swinging with steady devotion. Tick, tick, tick. Edwin glanced at it and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Poirot noticed. "You look at the clock the way some people look at a gun," Poirot remarked gently. Edwin swallowed. "It feels like it decides things." Poirot nodded. "Then tonight," he said, "we remove that illusion." Poirot rose and crossed the hallway slowly. He did not attempt to be quiet. His steps landed naturally on the wooden floor, the sound firm and honest. The house responded the way it should, creaking softly, acknowledging movement. Without drama, Poirot opened the clock casing. Edwin stood behind him, watching. Poirot examined the mechanism in the dim light. "You see," Poirot murmured, "it has been tended recently. Fresh oil. Alignment too perfect." Edwin's voice was tight. "Someone adjusted it." Poirot nodded. "Not to keep time," he said, "to keep obedience." Poirot reached inside and touched the pendulum gently. He adjusted it, just slightly. Not enough to stop the clock, not enough to break it, just enough to introduce imperfection. Edwin frowned. "Will it still chime?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but perhaps not with the certainty your visitor prefers." Edwin stared. "Visitor?" Poirot closed the casing. "The footsteps," Poirot said softly, "belong to someone who expects this house to answer." Edwin's stomach twisted. "You think they'll come tonight?" Poirot returned to the sitting room. "I think," he said, "they will be unable to resist. Checking." Poirot placed Lydia's modified radio on the table. Edwin looked at it and felt a faint wave of disgust. An ordinary object turned into a tool of fear. Poirot turned the dial slowly. The hum appeared almost at once, faint but unmistakable. Edwin shivered. Poirot held up one finger. "Listen," he said. They waited. At first, only the hum. Then, after a minute, something else. A click, a pause, another click. Poirot nodded. "He checks the line," Poirot murmured. "Like a man checking a lock," Edwin whispered. "He!" Poirot did not correct him. Poirot adjusted the dial slightly. The hum sharpened. A faint voice emerged, as if speaking from a small room with padded walls. "Stand by!" Edwin's hands clenched on the armrests. Poirot leaned slightly toward the radio. "No," Poirot said calmly. The hum faltered. The voice returned, sharper. "Who is this?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Someone who listens," he replied. A pause. Then the voice spoke. Again, controlled, irritated. "You are interfering." Poirot's tone remained polite. "Yes," he said. "That is my intention." The hum spiked briefly, then softened again, like a person swallowing anger. "You have disrupted the sequence," the voice said. Poirot nodded. "Sequence," he repeated softly. "A very telling word." Edwin stared at Poirot in disbelief. "He can hear you," Edwin whispered. Poirot glanced at him. "He hears my presence," Poirot corrected. "Whether he hears my exact words depends on his equipment. But his reaction tells us enough." Poirot turned the dial and cut the signal. The room felt suddenly quiet again. Edwin exhaled shakily. "What did we do?" Poirot folded his hands. "We placed doubt into the machine," he said, "and doubt is poison to control." The minutes toward midnight stretched again. Edwin found himself watching the clock, even though Poirot had told him not to. He could not help it. The house itself seemed to gather around that moment, as though everything waited for the chime. At 11:55 p.m., Poirot stood. "Come," he said quietly. They moved into the hallway together. Poirot turned on the hallway light. Edwin blinked. "Why?" Poirot met his gaze. "Because darkness makes sound more powerful," he said. "We will not give it that advantage." They stood beneath the clock. The pendulum swung patiently. Tick, tick, tick. Poirot's eyes flicked toward Edwin. "You are afraid," Poirot said gently. Edwin did not deny it. "Yes," Poirot nodded. "Fear is not shame," he said. "It is information. But tonight it does not command you." Edwin swallowed and tried to breathe more slowly. At 11:59 p.m., the house felt as if it leaned inward. The minute hand reached the top. The clock chimed. Chime. The sound rang out. Slightly different now, its tone subtly altered by Poirot's adjustment. Not broken, not wrong, just imperfect. Edwin held his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Poirot watched carefully. Then, very faintly, came a sound Edwin had not expected. Not footsteps in the hallway, footsteps outside, on the pavement, slow, measured, approaching the house. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "He is here," Poirot murmured. Edwin's stomach dropped. "He came himself?" Poirot nodded. "He cannot tolerate uncertainty," he said. "He must see whether the machine still obeys." The footsteps outside stopped. A shadow passed across the frosted glass of the front door. Then came a knock, soft, confident, not a polite request for entry, a declaration. Edwin's hands trembled. Poirot did not move. He turned to Edwin and spoke calmly. "Do not open the door," Poirot said. Edwin whispered. "What if—" Poirot's expression remained steady. "We will not play his game," Poirot said. "We will change the rules." The knock came again. Poirot walked to the door and called through it. "Good evening," Poirot said pleasantly. Silence. Then, from the other side, a voice, muffled by wood, controlled but tense. "You shouldn't be here," Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet," he replied, "here I am." The door handle moved slightly. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "He believes he has permission," Poirot murmured. Edwin's voice shook. "Does he?" Poirot's tone was gentle. "Not any more," he said. Poirot stepped back from the door and gestured for Edwin to remain behind him. Edwin obeyed, trembling. Poirot spoke loudly enough to be heard clearly. "You have been listening," Poirot said. Silence. Poirot continued. You built a sequence, he said. A chime, then footsteps, then silence, then obedience. Still silence. Poirot's voice softened slightly. But you made a mistake, he said. You believed the house belonged to you. The handle moved again. Poirot waited. Then, without warning, the handle stopped. The footsteps outside shifted. A pause. Then the footsteps retreated only a few steps, then stopped again, as if the person outside were deciding whether to leave or to force the situation. Poirot turned to Edwin. "He is thinking," Poirot whispered. "That is good." Edwin stared. "Good?" Poirot nodded. "A man who thinks," he said, "cannot perform perfectly." The footsteps outside moved away, not fast, not fleeing, but withdrawing. Poirot listened. He waited until the sound was gone. Then he returned to the sitting room and sat down calmly. Edwin remained standing, shaken. Poirot looked at him gently. "This," Poirot said, "was the hour between commands." Edwin whispered, "And now?" Poirot folded his hands. "Now," he said, "he will make a decision." Edwin swallowed. "What decision?" Poirot's eyes were calm. "Whether to abandon his listener," Poirot said, "or to retrieve her." Edwin felt cold fear bloom again. Poirot raised one finger, as if slowing the night itself. "And because he has come," Poirot added softly, "we know where to go next." The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. For the first time, Edwin felt the sound as ordinary again, not powerful, not commanding, just time. Chapter 6. The Man Who Waited for Permission. There are two kinds of silence. The first is ordinary, the quiet of a sleeping house, the peaceful absence of noise. The second is deliberate, the silence that waits for a cue. Hercule Poirot had spent much of his life listening for that second kind. It was present now, not in the hallway or the sitting room, but somewhere beyond the front door, somewhere out in the city, where a man stood in the dark and decided what came next. Edwin Hargrove felt the aftershocks of the knock long after the footsteps had retreated. He sat again in the sitting room, hands clasped together, trying to slow his breathing. The air inside the house felt thin, as though it had been held too tightly. Poirot, by contrast, appeared calm enough to be sipping tea at any normal hour. He did not pace. He did not rehearse plans aloud. He simply listened. Tick, tick, tick. The clock remained steady. Edwin stared at it. "He came," Edwin whispered. Poirot nodded. "Yes," Edwin swallowed. "And he left." Poirot's eyes moved gently toward Edwin. "Temporarily," he corrected. "Do not imagine a man like this leaves a performance unfinished." Edwin's throat tightened. "You think he'll return tonight?" Poirot considered. "I think he will return," he said, "but not necessarily tonight." Edwin looked pained. "How can you be so sure?" Poirot's voice remained soft. "Because," he said, "he has trained himself to require permission." Edwin frowned. "Permission from whom?" Poirot smiled faintly. "From the sequence," he said. "From the rhythm, from the belief that sound tells him what to do." They spoke quietly until dawn. Poirot asked Edwin questions about Lydia, but not the kind Edwin expected. Poirot did. Not ask where she liked to go, who her friends were, or what she might have been doing the day she disappeared. Instead, Poirot asked about timing. "When did she begin working later hours?" Poirot asked. Edwin thought. "A month ago. She said the theatre had a new sound project." Poirot nodded. "And did she ever seem distracted when she returned home?" Edwin hesitated. "She was quieter." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Quieter than usual, or quieter by instruction?" Edwin looked at him sharply. "I don't know," Edwin admitted. Poirot nodded, satisfied. "We will know," he said. By late morning, Poirot had arranged for discreet assistance. Not a dramatic police presence, not uniformed men on the street. Poirot did not want the city to feel watched. Control thrived when it could claim secrecy. Instead, Poirot spoke to one inspector privately and asked for something simple: observation. If the man returned, he wanted him to feel unchallenged, right up until the moment's certainty collapsed. Edwin followed Poirot as they walked through Marroway Crescent in daylight. The street looked ordinary again. A neighbor shook out a rug. A child carried a loaf of bread in both hands, concentrating hard. Somewhere a radio played a cheerful tune that felt almost inappropriate after the previous nights. Edwin lowered his voice. "How can anyone walk here and not feel it?" Poirot glanced at him kindly. "Most people," Poirot said, "do not hear the night after sunrise." Edwin frowned. "But I do." Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said, "because you were invited to listen." That afternoon, Poirot returned to the industrial district alone. He did not enter the bellwether storage lofts, not yet. He walked around the building slowly, noting entrances and exits, watching the placement of windows, listening to how sound moved. A place like that did not only hold silence, it directed it. Poirot paused near a side door. Its lock was old, but it had been oiled recently. Poirot smiled faintly. "Of course," he murmured. He continued past it. He was not there to break in. He was there to understand how a man like Calder would want to enter, because criminals did not only choose locations, they chose rituals. They moved through spaces in ways that pleased their own sense of order. Poirot returned to Marroway Crescent as dusk approached. The air cooled, the street lamps flickered on, and the quiet hour began to form itself again. Edwin tried to eat dinner, but food tasted like paper. Poirot ate politely, unbothered. "You must keep your strength," Poirot reminded Edwin softly. Edwin pushed his plate away. "How can you eat?" Poirot looked at him calmly. "Because," he said, "panic is the meal your enemy prefers." Edwin swallowed and tried again. Later, Poirot asked Edwin to do something surprising. He asked him to walk down the hallway loudly. Edwin blinked. "Loudly?" "Yes," Poirot said. "No tiptoeing, no soft steps. Walk like you belong here." Edwin hesitated. Then he did it. His footsteps sounded strange on the runner rug, duller than on bare wood, but still present. The house responded with faint creaks, honest noises of living. Poirot nodded approvingly. "This is your house," Poirot said. "It must remember that." Edwin stopped at the end of the hall beneath the clock. It ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Edwin glanced at Poirot. "What does this do?" Poirot smiled gently. "It changes the stage," he said. "It reminds the performer that the audience is no longer obedient." Night came. The lamps were left on softly again. The radio sat on the table, turned off for now. Edwin sat with his back straight, trying not to watch the clock. Poirot sat calmly, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the hallway, then back to Edwin's face. At 11:20 p.m., nothing happened. At 11:30 p.m., nothing happened. At 11:40 p.m., the radio hummed faintly, though Poirot had not touched. Edwin stiffened. "It's—" Poirot raised one finger. "Yes," he whispered. "Now we listen." Poirot leaned forward and adjusted the dial slightly. The hum sharpened. A faint click followed. Then, after a pause, a voice emerged, low, controlled. "Report!" Edwin's breath caught. Poirot spoke calmly into the radio. "No report," he said. A pause. The voice returned, sharper. "Who is this?" Poirot's tone remained mild. "A man who dislikes amateur theatre," he said. The hum wavered. "You are interfering," the voice said again, with irritation now more exposed. Poirot nodded. "Yes?" A longer pause. Then the voice spoke, slower this time. "I know where you are." Poirot smiled faintly. "Excellent," Poirot replied. "Then you will not waste my time." Silence. Edwin's hands trembled. Poirot kept his voice steady. "You came last night," Poirot said softly. "You knocked like a man who expects obedience." Another pause. Poirot continued. "But you did not enter," he said, "because you were waiting for permission." The hum sharpened, as though the person on the other end had leaned closer. "You do not understand," the voice said quietly. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "I understand perfectly," Poirot replied. "You have built your life on cues. You do not move without them." The hum spiked suddenly, then cut. The radio went dead. Edwin stared at Poirot. "You provoked him?" Poirot nodded. "Yes," he said, "because now he must act without the comfort of his sequence." Edwin swallowed. "And what will he do?" Poirot's voice remained calm. "He will come," Poirot said, "but differently." The house settled into deep night. The clock ticked. Tick, tick, tick. Edwin felt himself drifting, part exhaustion, part the soothing monotony of waiting. At 12:07 a.m., a sound came from outside. not footsteps on the pavement, a vehicle stopping quietly. Poirot's head lifted at once. He rose. Edwin stood too, heart racing. Poirot did not rush to the window. He walked calmly to the hallway and turned down the lamp slightly, leaving enough light to see but not enough to cast dramatic shadows. Then he waited by the front door. A soft scrape sounded outside. Not a knock, not footsteps, something else. A key? Edwin's throat tightened. He has a key? Poirot did not look surprised. Of course, he murmured. He prefers permission. The lock clicked, the door handle turned slowly, and the front door opened just a fraction, enough to let in a slice of colder air. Poirot spoke gently into the gap. "Good evening," he said. The door froze. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then a man's voice, very close, very controlled, answered. "You shouldn't have changed the chime." Poirot smiled faintly. "And you should not have depended on it," he replied. The door opened a little wider. A tall man stepped inside, neatly dressed, hair combed back, gloves on. His hands as though this were not a crime, but a ritual. His eyes flicked instantly to the hallway clock. Poirot noticed. The man's posture tightened when he heard the tick, 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 tick. Not the tick he expected, not the perfect tick, the slightly imperfect one. The man's gaze sharpened. "You broke it," he said quietly. Poirot's voice remained gentle. "No," he corrected. "I freed it." The man's jaw clenched. Edwin stood frozen behind Poirot, staring. Poirot spoke softly, as though addressing a performer who had forgotten his lines. "You are Julian Calder," Poirot said. The man did not deny it. Instead he whispered, "Where is she?" Poirot met his gaze calmly. "Safe," Poirot said, and no longer listening. For the first time, Calder's composure cracked. Not dramatically, but subtly. A small tremor in the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a quick inhale that revealed something raw underneath. "You ruined everything," Calder whispered. Poirot's voice remained steady. "No," he said, "you did." Footsteps sounded behind Calder, not inside the house, outside, uniformed, measured. The police had arrived quietly, as Poirot intended. Calder's eyes widened slightly. Poirot stepped aside. "This," Poirot said softly, "is the moment when you must act without permission." Calder looked toward the door, then toward the hallway clock, then back again. He hesitated, and in that hesitation he revealed the truth Poirot had suspected all along. He could not move without a cue. The police entered. Calder did not resist. He simply stood there, as though waiting for a chime that would never come. When the house was quiet again, Edwin sat down heavily. Poirot returned to the sitting room and poured tea. Edwin stared at him. "You knew he'd come." Poirot nodded. "Men like him," Poirot said, "cannot tolerate an unfinished sequence." Edwin's voice shook. "But Lydia, where is she?" Poirot's gaze softened. "That," he said, "is our next step." Edwin swallowed. "You think she's still alive?" Poirot met his eyes, calm and certain. "Yes," Poirot said, "because she left you a message, whether she knew it or not." Edwin frowned. "What message?" Poirot stood. He walked toward the stairs. "We will find it," he said softly, "where silence was taught." Chapter 7, Where Silence is Taught. There are places that teach silence the way others teach language, not by forbidding sound, but by shaping it, by softening footsteps until they feel unnecessary, by absorbing echoes until voices lose their confidence, by creating spaces where stillness feels like obedience rather than absence. Hercule Poirot understood these places instinctively. As dawn crept slowly across the city, he stood outside the bellwether storage lofts once more, Edwin Hargrove beside him. The building rose quietly against the pale sky, its brickwork darkened by age, its windows dull with dust. It did not announce itself, it did not invite attention, it simply waited. "This is where she learned to listen," Poirot said softly. Edwin's chest tightened. "And where he taught her?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, but more importantly, where she taught herself to wait." They entered through the side door Poirot had noticed the day before. The lock yielded easily, as though it had been opened many times with the same care. Inside, the air felt different from the house on Marroway Crescent. Here, sound did not travel far. Even Edwin's breathing seemed muted, as if the building itself discouraged excess noise. Poirot closed the door gently behind them. "Do not whisper," Poirot said quietly. "Whispering gives silence too much power." Edwin nodded and adjusted his breathing. They moved down a wide corridor lined with heavy doors. Each door was marked faintly with old numbers, remnants of the building's former life as rehearsal space for radio and theater. Productions, sound engineers, musicians, voice actors, all had once practiced here, learning how to control their presence in a room. Poirot paused. "This place," he said, "was never about noise. It was always about restraint." Edwin glanced at the doors uneasily. "How do we know which room?" Poirot smiled faintly. "We listen," he said. Poirot walked slowly, allowing his steps to land naturally. Most doors responded with a faint change in air pressure, a subtle echo, a suggestion of space beyond. But one door near the end of the corridor did not respond at all. Poirot stopped. "This one," he said. Edwin stared at the door. "It feels empty." Poirot shook his head. "No," he said. "It feels contained." Poirot placed his hand against the door. There was no vibration, no echo, no answering presence. "This room," Poirot said softly, "has been trained." He turned the handle and opened the door. Inside, the room was larger than Edwin expected. The walls were lined with thick sound-dampening panels arranged with almost artistic care. The floor was padded. The ceiling hung low, making the space feel intimate rather than expansive. At the center stood a single wooden chair beneath a hanging lamp, and seated in that chair was Lydia Hargrove. She sat upright, her posture composed, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Her eyes were open, calm, and alert. Not frightened, not distant, but listening. She looked up as the door opened. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. Edwin froze. "Lydia," he whispered. She turned toward him slowly. Her expression softened, not with shock, but with recognition. "I knew it would change," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "You noticed?" he said. "Yes," Lydia replied. "The timing broke." Poirot did not rush forward, neither did Edwin. Poirot understood that sudden movement would shatter the careful balance Lydia had built for herself. Silence, once shaped, did not release its hold all at once. It loosened gradually. Poirot spoke gently. "You are safe now," he said. Lydia nodded once. "I know." Edwin's voice trembled. "How can you be so calm?" Lydia considered this. "Because nothing is telling me what to do anymore," she said. Poirot stepped into the room. Edwin followed slower, unsure of where to place his feet. Poirot gestured toward the chair. "You may stand if you wish," Poirot said. Lydia did not move immediately. "I was told to wait," she said softly. Poirot met her gaze steadily. "That instruction has ended," he said. She inhaled. Then she stood. They sat together on the floor, away from the chair. The lamp dimmed slightly to soften the space. Poirot asked Lydia to speak, not quickly, not completely, but in her own time. She told them about Julian Calder, not as a villain, but as a voice. "He never frightened me," Lydia said. "He explained." Poirot nodded. "He taught me that silence was safer than noise," she continued. "That footsteps could be controlled. That waiting was strength." Edwin clenched his fists. Poirot remained still. "He said the world was too loud," Lydia said, "too demanding, that if I learned when to move and when to stay still, I would never be surprised again." Poirot's voice was gentle. "And did it work?" Lydia shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It just made the surprises quieter." Lydia described the routines, the radio signals, the metronome, the repeated walks through the hallway. "At first," she said, "it felt like discipline, like learning a skill." Poirot nodded. "Many cages are introduced as lessons." Lydia smiled faintly. "He taught me to disappear without panic," she said, "to leave rooms without sound, to wait until a signal told me it was safe." Edwin whispered, "Why didn't you run?" Lydia looked at him sadly. "Because," she said, "I thought waiting meant control." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And now?" he asked. Lydia exhaled. "Now," she said, "I hear how small the silence really is." They did not leave immediately. Poirot insisted on something important. "You must walk out of this room," he said, "without instruction." Lydia hesitated. The doorway felt farther away than it truly was. Poirot waited. Edwin waited. No one spoke. Lydia took one step forward. Her foot landed awkwardly. The sound startled her. She laughed softly, an uncertain sound, but genuine. Poirot smiled. "That," he said, "is how freedom sounds." She took another step, then another. Her footsteps were uneven, human. They reached the corridor. The silence here felt different now, not commanding, not heavy, but passive. They walked together toward the exit. Poirot allowed his steps to be clearly heard. Edwin followed. Lydia walked between them. Outside, daylight welcomed them without ceremony. The city made noise, cars passed, voices overlapped. A radio played from an open window somewhere down the street. Lydia closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. "It's loud," she said. Poirot nodded. "Yes," she smiled faintly. "I think I like that." They returned to Marroway Crescent in the early afternoon. The house looked the same as ever, but Lydia noticed the difference immediately. "The rug," she said softly. "Yes," Poirot replied. "It softened too much." Edwin asked. "Should we remove it?" Poirot considered. "Not yet," he said. "First it must lose its authority." That evening Lydia walked the hallway deliberately. She did not tiptoe. She did not correct herself. Her footsteps echoed lightly. The house responded honestly. Later, as night settled, Poirot prepared to leave. "You're going?" Edwin asked, startled. "Yes," Poirot said. "Some silences must finish on their own." Lydia looked at him carefully. "What if it comes back?" she asked. Poirot smiled gently. "Then you answer it," he said, "with your own sound." She nodded. Poirot stepped into the night. Behind him the house rested. No footsteps followed. Chapter 8. The sound that followed them home. Some sounds leave when you do. Others follow, not loudly, not insistently, but faithfully. Like habits that have not yet been told, they are no longer needed. Lydia Hargrove noticed this as the motor car carried them back toward Marroway Crescent. The city passed by the window in slow, unremarkable scenes, shops opening, doors closing, footsteps overlapping without rhythm or care. It was all perfectly ordinary, and yet she listened, not because she was afraid, but because listening had become familiar. Edwin sat beside her, saying little. He had tried conversation once or twice, offering reassurances that sounded unnecessary the moment they left his mouth. Lydia did not need to be told she was safe. She needed time to recognize that safety no longer required permission. Poirot had chosen to sit in front beside the driver, his posture relaxed, his gaze drifting occasionally to the street ahead. He did not speak. He rarely did at moments like this. He knew that silence, once reclaimed, should not be rushed to fill itself. As they turned onto Marroway Crescent, Lydia felt a tightening in her chest. "There," Edwin said softly. "We're home." The word sounded different now. The house stood as it always had, quiet, modest, unremarkable. Its door did not open eagerly. Its windows did not watch them approach. It simply waited, the way buildings do when they are no longer performing for someone else. Lydia paused on the pavement. She did not step forward at once. Poirot noticed but did not comment. Edwin hesitated, then stopped beside her. "What do you hear?" Edwin asked gently. Lydia closed her eyes. She heard a distant radio playing somewhere down the street. A door closing 2 houses away, a pair of footsteps passing without slowing. She opened her eyes. "I hear everything," she said. "At once." Poirot nodded. "That," he said, "is what happens when instruction ends. Sound returns to its natural state, disordered, overlapping, free." Lydia considered this and stepped forward. Inside, the house felt smaller than she remembered. Not constricting, intimate. The hallway stretched before her, the runner rug still in place, its fibers smoothed as carefully as ever. The clock stood at the far end, its face pale and calm, its pendulum swinging steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Lydia stopped. Edwin held his breath. Poirot waited. "The tick is uneven," Lydia said quietly. Poirot smiled faintly. "Yes, it's wrong," she added. Poirot shook his head gently. "No," he said, "it is honest." Lydia listened again. The difference was subtle, something only someone who had been trained to hear patterns would notice. The rhythm was slightly imperfect now, a fraction slower than before. Its certainty softened. She exhaled. "That helps," she said. They did not explore the house immediately. Poirot insisted on something simpler first. Tea. The kettle boiled. Cups were placed on the table. The clink of porcelain felt loud, almost excessive. but comforting in its familiarity. They sat together in the kitchen, sunlight slanting in through the window, dust motes drifted lazily in the air. Edwin watched Lydia closely, not anxiously, but attentively. She held her cup with both hands, warming her fingers, her posture relaxed but thoughtful. "You don't have to stay," she said suddenly to Poirot. Poirot looked at her calmly. "I know," he replied, "but I will for a little while." She nodded. The afternoon passed quietly. Lydia moved through the house slowly, reacquainting herself with rooms she knew intimately yet now experienced differently. She opened cupboards, touched walls, stood in doorways, and listened, not for signals, but for herself. In the sitting room she paused beside the radio, not the modified one that had been removed, but an older set that had sat unused on a shelf for years. She turned it on briefly. Music filled the room. Too much. She turned it off again and smiled faintly. "Not yet," she said. Poirot observed from the doorway. "You are learning to choose," he said. She nodded. "It feels, unfamiliar." Poirot smiled gently. "Freedom often does." As evening approached, Edwin grew restless. He tried to hide it, but Lydia noticed. "You're waiting," she said. Edwin sighed. "I can't help it." "For midnight," she said. He nodded. Lydia considered this for a moment. "Then we'll meet it," she said. They sat together in the sitting room as night fell. The lamps were lit softly, casting warm light without shadows sharp enough to invite imagination. The hallway remained visible, not ominous, simply present. Poirot sat with them, his presence steady and unobtrusive. The clock ticked, tick, tick, tick. Edwin watched the minute. Hand climb. Lydia watched the space between sounds. At 11:59 p.m. the house felt alert again, not tense but attentive. The clock chimed. Chime, the sound rang out clearly, resonant and complete. Nothing followed, no footsteps, no pause thick with expectation, just the quiet continuation of time. Edwin's shoulders sagged as tension left them. He laughed softly, surprised by the sound of his own relief. "It didn't come," he said. Lydia nodded. "Because it doesn't know where to go anymore." Poirot smiled faintly. "Because," he said, "it no longer has an audience." Later, after Edwin had gone to bed, Lydia remained awake. She sat alone in the hallway beneath the clock, listening. The tick no longer felt like instruction. It felt like presence, steady, imperfect, alive. She stood. She walked the length of the hallway deliberately. Her footsteps echoed lightly. They were uneven, unpracticed, human. She smiled. Poirot prepared to leave before dawn. Edwin met him at the door, gratitude evident in every line of his face. "You're certain?" Edwin asked quietly. Poirot nodded. "As certain as one can be about human habits." "And Lydia?" Edwin pressed. Poirot glanced toward the hallway. "She will hear echoes," Poirot said, "at unexpected moments, in unfamiliar places." Edwin frowned. "Is that dangerous?" Poirot shook his head. "No," he said. "It is memory, and memory fades when it is no longer obeyed." Edwin nodded slowly. Poirot turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing," he said. Edwin looked up. "Do not rush to fill the silence," Poirot said gently. "Let it learn." Edwin smiled faintly. "I think we both will." As Poirot walked away from Marroway Crescent, the city stirred around him. Radios came alive with morning broadcasts. Doors opened. Footsteps overlapped in careless abundance. Noise reclaimed its place. Behind him, in a quiet house with an imperfect clock, Lydia Hargrove slept peacefully, for the first time in weeks. The sound that had followed her home lingered briefly, then faded, not banished, released. Chapter 9. The Last Listener. Some people believe the world is too unpredictable to endure. They cannot accept the ordinary mess of life. Voices overlapping, plans changing, footsteps arriving out of order. They want the comfort of sequences. They want the certainty of cues. They want the night to behave like a script. And when they cannot find that certainty naturally, they try to manufacture it. Julian Calder had manufactured it with remarkable care. But now, without Lydia, without the radio answering him, without the clock on Marroway Crescent obeying the exact rhythm he preferred, his creation had begun to collapse. Not dramatically, not loudly. It collapsed collapsed the way a performance collapses when the audience stops applauding, quietly, shamefully, and all at once. Hercule Poirot understood that the end of the case did not necessarily arrive at the moment Lydia returned home. In truth, the end arrived when the last listener stopped listening, and Calder, Poirot suspected, would resist that moment with everything he had. 2 days after Lydia returned, Poirot visited the holding facility where Calder had been placed. The building was not imposing. It did not need to be. Its power came from routine, doors that opened and closed at precise times, corridors that carried sound in controlled ways, lights that hummed steadily without fluctuation. Poirot disliked the hum. It reminded him too much of Lydia's modified radio. He was escorted to a small interview room. Inside there were 2 chairs, a table, pale walls, and an overhead light that remained indifferent to human emotion. Calder sat alone. He looked exactly as he had that night at Maraway Crescent, neatly dressed, hair combed back, posture perfectly composed. His hands were folded on the table with the patient certainty of a man who believed waiting would eventually bring him what he wanted. Poirot stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. "Good morning," Poirot said pleasantly. Calder lifted his eyes. "You came," he said. Poirot sat opposite him. "Yes," Poirot replied. "I came to listen." Calder smiled faintly. "You always say that," he remarked. Poirot nodded. "And you," Poirot replied gently, "always wait." They sat in silence for a moment. Poirot did not rush to fill it. Calder did not either. That alone told Poirot something important. Calder did not fear silence. He relied on it. Silence to him was not emptiness, it was discipline. "Do you know," Calder said at last, "that she will never be the same?" Poirot regarded him calmly. "No one is," Poirot replied, "after being treated as an instrument." Calder's smile tightened. "You talk as if I harmed her," he said. Poirot's voice remained gentle. "You removed choice," Poirot said. "Choice is the quietest form of life." Calder's eyes flickered. He leaned forward slightly. "She chose," Calder insisted. "At first she chose." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "At first." Calder's jaw tightened. Poirot continued, his tone soft but precise. "And then," Poirot said, "you taught her that choosing was dangerous." Calder fell silent. Poirot watched him carefully. The smallest tension appeared in Calder's mouth, as though he had bitten back a response. It was not fear, it was annoyance, the irritation of a man hearing the truth spoken in a way he could not interrupt. "You misunderstand me," Calder said finally. Poirot tilted his head. "Then explain yourself." Calder exhaled. He spoke in the manner of someone defending an art rather than a crime. "The world is loud," Calder said. "People talk without meaning. They move without awareness. They step heavily like they're angry at the floor." Poirot listened without expression. Calder continued. "I wasn't taking anything from her," he said. "I was giving her control. I was teaching her to move through space without friction." Poirot's eyes remained steady. "Without friction," Poirot repeated softly. Calder nodded. "Yes, if you can predict the moment, you can predict the feeling. If you can predict the feeling, you can prevent fear." Poirot smiled faintly. "That is an illusion," he said. Calder frowned. "No, it's discipline." Poirot's tone did not change. "It is only discipline," Poirot said, "if the person can leave the lesson at will." Calder's fingers tightened against the table. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "When Lydia tried to leave," Poirot said, "what happened?" Calder's eyes narrowed. "She didn't try." Poirot nodded as if he expected that answer. "Because you taught her," Poirot said gently, "that leaving meant failing." Calder's voice sharpened. "She was close," he said. "She was close to understanding." Poirot looked at him. "What was she meant to understand?" Poirot asked quietly. Calder's gaze held Poirot's. "That waiting is power," he said. Poirot nodded once. "And that," Poirot replied, "is exactly the lie." A long silence settled. Even the overhead hum felt quieter, as if the room itself waited for Calder to speak again. "You think you ended it?" Calder said softly. Poirot nodded. "Yes." Calder smiled, a small, tired smile. She will hear it again, Calder said. In hallways. At night. When a clock ticks too steadily. When a radio hums, she will listen. Poirot did not deny this. Yes, he said. She will. Calder's smile grew faintly triumphant. Then you did not end it, Calder said. Poirot's expression remained calm. I did, Poirot replied. Because now she will choose how to answer it, Calder frowned. Poirot continued gently. You trained her to wait for permission, Poirot said. But the first time she walks loudly, down a hallway, your training breaks, Calder's jaw tightened. The first time she turns on a light when she feels fear, Poirot added. The first time she speaks instead of obeying silence, your sequence collapses. Calder looked away. For the first time he seemed tired, not exhausted physically, but exhausted in the way a performer becomes exhausted when the stage no longer belongs to him. You don't understand, Calder murmured again. Poirot stood. No, Poirot said softly. I understand too well. Poirot left the interview room without haste. In the corridor outside, footsteps echoed normally. Guards spoke quietly. Doors opened and closed at their scheduled times. Routine continued. But for Calder, routine had lost its meaning. Poirot stepped out into daylight. The city greeted him with ordinary noise, cars, voices, street vendors calling softly, a radio playing cheerfully somewhere nearby. Poirot paused near a shop window where several radios were displayed. One played music, one played news, one played static, all at once, imperfect, alive. Poirot smiled faintly. This, he thought, is how sound should behave. That evening, Lydia sat in the sitting room at Marroway Crescent, alone but not lonely. Edwin had gone to buy groceries. The house had become familiar again, though not quite the same. It felt lighter now, as though it had unlearned a terrible habit. The runner rug had been rolled up and placed in the spare room. Bare floorboards stretched down the hallway, honest and responsive. Lydia walked across them in her socks. Her footsteps were audible. She paused beneath the clock. Tick, tick, tick. The rhythm was imperfect. She liked that. She turned the hallway light on, then off, then on again. Not because she needed the light, but because she could. She smiled faintly at her own quiet rebellion. Later, when Edwin returned, Lydia told him about the interview, though Poirot had not described it to her. How do you know he thinks you'll listen? Edwin asked. Lydia shrugged gently. Because he needed me to, she said. People like that don't want silence, they want response. Edwin nodded slowly. And you won't? He asked. Lydia looked toward the hallway. The house was calm. Sometimes I'll hear it, she admitted, but I won't obey it. Edwin's shoulders lowered, relief softening him. Lydia smiled. We'll make our own sounds, she said. Night came. The clock chimed. Nothing followed. The house did not wait. And somewhere, behind walls designed to control routine, Julian Calder sat in a quiet room without a radio, without a metronome, without a clock that answered him. He waited, but the silence did not respond. And that was the true end. Chapter 10, After the Final Chime. Every mystery ends, whether it wishes to or not. Some end with noise, raised voices, slammed doors, sudden revelations that demand attention. Others end the way night ends, without announcement, without urgency, simply by giving way to morning. Hercule Poirot preferred the second kind. He stood at the edge of Marroway Crescent just after sunrise, his coat neatly buttoned, his gloved hands resting lightly on his walking stick. The street was waking slowly. Curtains shifted. A door opened somewhere down the row. A radio crackled to life with the low murmur of morning news. The world was making sound again. Behind him, the Hargrove house stood quietly. It did not watch him leave. It did not wait for instruction. It simply existed, settled once more into the ordinary rhythm it had nearly forgotten. Poirot listened for footsteps. None followed. He smiled faintly. Inside the house, Edwin Hargrove sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea warming his hands. The exhaustion on his face was different now, not sharp, not anxious, but earned, the kind that followed release rather than fear. Across the room, Lydia moved calmly, opening a window and letting the cool morning air drift in. The curtains stirred. Dust motes caught the light. Edwin watched her quietly. She had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that would catch the attention of strangers, But the tension that once lived in her shoulders had softened. Her movements were slower, less precise, not careless, human. "Did you sleep?" Edwin asked. Lydia nodded. "Yes," he smiled. "No footsteps?" She shook her head. "Just the house." Edwin laughed softly. "That sounds like a good thing." "It is," Lydia said. They moved through the morning without hurry. Breakfast was simple, toast slightly burned, tea a little too strong. Lydia laughed at both. The hallway felt different now that the runner rug was gone. Bare wooden boards responded honestly to weight, each step producing a faint echo that belonged entirely to the person who made it. Lydia walked its length slowly. She stopped beneath the clock. The clock still hung where it always had. Tall, dignified, familiar. Its casing bore the smallest imperfection, barely noticeable unless one listened closely. The tick was no longer exact. The rhythm no longer demanded attention. Tick, tick, tick. It chimed the hour. Nothing followed. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment. Then she reached up and touched the side of the clock gently, not to adjust it, not to silence it, but simply to acknowledge its presence. "Time again," she said softly. Edwin nodded. "Just time." Poirot boarded his train shortly before noon. He chose a seat near the window and settled himself with careful precision. The carriage was quiet, but not silent. A newspaper rustled. Someone coughed. A child whispered questions that received patient answers. The engine hissed. The train began to move. Poirot watched the city slide past the window, brick and stone giving way to open space, the density of sound thinning and then returning in waves. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. Cases did not leave Poirot the moment they ended. They lingered for a while, echoing softly before settling into memory, but this one felt lighter than most. It had ended the way it should have, with choice restored. In the holding facility, Julian Calder sat alone. The room was plain, pale walls, a narrow bed, a small table, no clock, no radio, no hum to fill the silence. At first, Calder listened. He waited for something, a cue, a vibration, a signal that would tell him where he was in the sequence. Nothing came. Minutes passed, then hours. Silence did not shift to accommodate him. It did not stretch or tighten or respond to expectation. For the first time, Calder experienced silence as it truly was. Not obedience, absence. He closed his eyes and waited anyway. Back on Marroway Crescent, afternoon gave way to evening. Edwin and Lydia sat together in the sitting room as daylight faded. The lamps were lit softly, not because darkness frightened them, but because light felt companionable. A small radio rested on the side table, not the modified one, an ordinary radio. Edwin glanced at it. "Do you want to turn it on?" Lydia considered. Then she shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "I like hearing the house." They sat quietly. The clock ticked. A door closed somewhere down the street. A car passed and faded. Ordinary sounds, reassuring in their lack of meaning. As night deepened, Edwin felt the familiar tightening return to his chest. Not sharp, but cautious. He glanced at Lydia. She noticed. "Midnight," she said. "Yes," Edwin admitted. She stood. "Then let's not wait for it," she said. She walked down the hallway deliberately, her footsteps clear and unapologetic. She turned on the hallway light, then the sitting room light, then turned one off again. Not because she needed to, because she could. Edwin felt something loosen inside him. They returned to their chairs. The minute hand climbed. At 11:59 p.m., the house felt attentive, but not expectant. The clock chimed. Chime. The sound rang out, warm and complete. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no silence thick with instruction, just the continuation of the night. Edwin laughed softly. Lydia smiled. "That," she said, "was the final chime." Later, when Edwin had gone to bed, Lydia remained awake a little longer. She stood at the window looking out at the quiet street. The lamplight cast soft pools on the pavement. Shadows shifted gently with the breeze. She listened. There were no commands hidden in the sound, only life. She turned away from the window and walked down the hallway one last time before sleep. Her footsteps echoed softly, imperfect, free. Hercule Poirot arrived in another city before dawn. He stepped off the train, adjusted his coat, and merged quietly into the early crowd. Somewhere nearby, a radio played the weather. Somewhere else, a clock chimed slightly off the hour. Poirot smiled faintly. He had learned long ago that justice did not always announce itself with finality. Sometimes it arrived as a quiet permission to walk without fear, to listen without obedience, to live without waiting. As Poirot disappeared into the ordinary sound of the city, the world continued on its imperfect rhythm, and that, he believed, was the proper ending to any mystery. Old Time Radio sign off. Thank you for listening. If you drifted to sleep, rest well. If you stayed awake, thank you for keeping the quiet company. This has been a calm old time radio detective story from Hercule Mysteries. Remember, silence has no power unless we give it permission. End broadcast.